If you're relying on overly complex and super targeted adjustments for your color grades, you're likely chasing a solution for the wrong problem. The truth is, to go from a color grade like this to a color grade like this, all you need is one criminally underappreciated technique that makes a huge difference. In this video, I will show you exactly what the missing piece is, how to use it in any editing program, and why it's a total game changer. And the best part, you'll be killing two birds with one stone, because once you get this right, your color grades will improve in other areas almost automatically. The word photography comes from the Greek words phos, meaning light, and graphe, meaning drawing or writing. In essence, photography is drawing with light. This poetic definition may seem rather over-elaborate, but we just cannot deny its truth. Lighting isn't just the thing we need to take care of. It's the essence of everything we do when it comes to photography, videography, filmmaking, and color grading alike. So let me tell you, considering the idea that you might suck at something as fundamental as understanding light is not comfortable. I get that, especially if you've been doing this for a while now. I was there too, but truthfully speaking, leaving my ego aside and going back to the basics was one of the most impactful decisions for my visual storytelling, be it photography, filming, or color grading. Just by doing that, my color grades went from something like this to something like this, pretty much overnight. While I do encourage you to study the lighting in films, photographs, and other works of art, this is a color grading tutorial, so let's stick to what we can do here. Humans are more sensitive to light than they are to color. Therefore, getting our contrast right is crucial. However, contrast is neither a slider nor something you should read from the waveform when it comes to shaping light. Let me explain. Even though I demonstrate everything in Final Cut Pro, the same principles apply to Resolve, Premiere Pro, and pretty much every other editing program. Remember, on this channel, we want to learn concepts, not how to push buttons. That being said, if you increase the contrast in your image, you will shape the light to some extent. Because after all, increasing the contrast makes bright things brighter and dark things darker. This is a bit extreme, so let me back that off. Something like this. Using the pivot, you can decide where the break between light and dark will happen. But as you can see, bright things still get uniformly brighter and dark things still get uniformly darker. So any global contrast adjustment lacks the control of which things get brighter or darker and by how much. Unfortunately, this is where most people go wrong, because the opposite of no control is full control, right? So people rely heavily on tools like the magic mask or qualifiers to get their color grade to work. For example, let's get rid of my contrast adjustment and apply an instance of color wheels. If you want to make our subject brighter, you might want to use a tool like the magnetic mask and sample our subject and then make your adjustment. At first glance, this seems to work. However, this approach usually creates more problems than it solves. Look, targeted adjustments always need so much care to get them to look right. How many hours did you spend on refining masks to get rid of weird edges or halos? Yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Additionally, they require a lot of processing power and time. If you want to use a magnetic mask or a magic mask, you need to apply it and then track the scene, and then you need to tweak it and you refine it and then you track it again and over again, and this wastes so much time. This is the kind of shit that turns people away from enjoying color grading in the first place. The good news is, it doesn't have to be that way. If you're familiar with my color grading philosophy, you know I'm not a friend of complex node trees or techniques. In general, with my approach, I strive for simplicity. That means we don't need any fancy tools to get it right. The only thing we need are 4 guiding principles. First and foremost, light motivates our decisions. We should work with the light in our scene and not against it. So let's analyze our scene. As you can see, I did nothing else to my scene other than applying an instance of Dehancer. This gives us just a color space transformation from the red log footage, as it is unedited right here, to Rec 709, and it also applies a proper film emulation. In this case, we're going for the Kodak 2383 print film emulation. But don't worry, you don't need Dehancer to follow along. This is just my shortcut to get a somewhat decent look into place. Now back to our scene. The only light source is this lamp on the left here. It illuminates everything we're supposed to see, and our decision should respect the direction of the light. This means we can of course brighten this side of his face a bit, but we cannot make this evenly lit to this side of his face. This would just seem unnatural. Again, light motivates our decisions, so let's work with the light and don't try to achieve the unachievable. Next, when shaping the light, you can overcook a color grade really fast. To prevent myself from doing so, I always keep my second principle in mind, which says reduction beats addition. Imagine you want to have a meaningful conversation, but you are at a very busy location like a pub or a noisy restaurant. Speaking louder definitely solves the problem, but wouldn't it be much nicer if your environment was just a lot quieter? This is exactly what I try to achieve. Reduction beats addition. What does that mean in practice? If I think his face should be a bit brighter, I start with the inverse operation, so I don't brighten his face, I will reduce everything around it. So instead of throwing more brightness at certain elements in our scene, let's just take the distractions away instead. This is the same as going to a quieter location rather than speaking louder in our example from before. Let's get rid of my drawings. In our case, I think this above his head distracts me a little bit. So I will apply an instance of color wheels, move this before Dehancer, and apply a shape mask. So I can see what's going on. I will zoom out a bit and I will adjust everything accordingly, and I will increase the feather just a bit, something like this, until I have a good feeling about it. Maybe like so. Now I zoom in again. By the way, let me toggle the mask again. As you can see, I left the entire left-hand side of the frame free, because again, light motivates our decisions, and we have the light source on the left-hand side of the screen. So darkening the upper part of that wouldn't make any sense. Light wouldn't behave like this. Now I can get rid of the mask again. When reducing distractions, the highlight or gain wheel will probably be your friend most of the time. To keep our adjustments natural, we should be mindful of how the light would behave. So I can lower the highlights just like that, and it works really well. But as you can see, if I go too far, everything just becomes black and seems pretty unnatural. Also, I don't know if this makes its way through YouTube, but you can clearly see the shape of the mask here. So yeah, if I go too far, this looks completely off. But if I reset this and do this just in the right amount, this will actually do a fantastic job. So this might be a little bit strong already. Something like this. So let's have a look. This is before and this is after. And it clears up so much room for the subject in our scene. Let's go back out here and rename this real quick. I will just call this ceiling. Next, I'd like to enhance the background separation. So I will take a shape mask or power window again with an instance of color wheels. So before Dehancer like this. And I will apply this power window just roughly over our gentleman. So I'll tilt this just a bit and make the feather nice and large. Also, let's scrub through our clip and see whether we need to track it. And there is a little bit of movement here, but I think we can get away without tracking it. I try to avoid tracking wherever I can for the reasons I mentioned in the beginning of this video. Now I want to reduce the overall brightness of the outside area. So I go to the outside, and again I will use my highlights or my gain wheel and lower it just a little bit. But even though this looks already fantastic, you can see we run into a problem. If I toggle this adjustment on and off, so this is before and this is after, let's get rid of the mask, and again, before and after, I also reduce the brightness of the lamp, and this is not what we want. To avoid this, I will apply another shape mask, and by default, this will get rid of the adjustment over here. Also, I want to apply a large enough feather so this seems more natural. And let's have a look before and after. And this looks fantastic now. We have a clear background separation between our subject and the background. So before and after. Now I come out here and call this just background separation. So I would just type BG. This brings me to the third guideline. Less is more. Now would be a great time to take a break and look at something else. Seeing your adjustments with fresh eyes is really helpful. For this tutorial, I will just set the strength of my adjustments to 80%, as I'm usually a bit heavy-handed on the first pass. So let's have a look. I go into my ceiling adjustment and set this to 80%, like so. And I go into my background adjustment and set this to 80% as well, like so. And I think they make such a big difference. If we toggle them, this is before and this is after. Lastly, let's say this horse figure in the foreground is very important for the narrative of this piece. So if that's the case, we should increase the visibility of this shape a little bit. As this horse is a rather complex and detailed shape, there is this urge to use a tool like the magnetic mask or the shape mask. In the beginning of the video, I elaborated on why this is usually a bad idea. This brings me to the last principle. If it can't be done with a very simple power window or qualifier, don't do it. Chances are you're doing more harm than good. Let's try to resolve this differently and just use a simple power window. So I apply another instance of color wheels, move this again before the enhancer, and use a power window, shape mask, and just place it roughly on top of this horse, like so, with a large enough feather. So something like this. Again, let's crop through the clip if we can get away without tracking. And I think if I move it a little bit closer towards here, I think for the majority of the scene, this is fine and we get away. Yeah, it might depend on the effect. I might track it, but let's see. For the sake of this tutorial, I won't track it. Now let's turn this power window off. To increase the visibility, I will increase the contrast just a little bit. I will do this by boosting my midtones up. Just a touch. Something like this. And as you can see, this fogs up my dark areas in the horse and in the foreground as well. So I will counter this adjustment by using the shadows wheel or the lift wheel and push that down just a little bit. Something like this. And I might do another round. So I will increase the midtones just a bit like this. And again, I will counter this by bringing down the lift or the shadows. So let's have a look at how this looks. This is before and this is after. And have a look, we increased visibility so much. Again, I go out here and call this horse. Also, let's toggle this adjustment on and off again, so we can see whether or not we're actually doing something good. And I think this looks quite decent, but again, I will go in here and set this to 80% as well, as this is probably enough. So before, after, yeah. That's it. And just like that, we increased the visibility in the foreground dramatically without the need for any complex masking or tracking. Okay, now comes the fun part. I want to draw your attention to something very important. In this video, we only took care of shaping the light in our scene. As you can see, for general color grading, there is nothing else going on other than the film emulation by Dehancer. By the way, this video is not sponsored. Dehancer is just genuinely one of my favorite tools. Now, if we slap Dehancer with these exact settings onto our grayscale, so let's have a look, you can see there's a fair amount of split toning involved. So this is the grayscale without Dehancer, and this is the grayscale with Dehancer. Also, let's get rid of the color space transformation so we can see the curves a little bit more easily. Also, since I want to show you what's going on in the channels, let's actually turn off the grain as well, so we can have cleaner traces in the waveforms. This split toning comes from the 2383 print film emulation. If I switch to linear, you can see there is not so much going on, but if I go back to the 2383, you can see the highlights are a little bit warmer and the shadows are a little bit cooler. I can make this even more visible by switching my Luma waveform to RGB overlay. And here you can see the traces of the individual channels. The shadows are a bit cooler and the highlights are a bit warmer. Let's go back to our scene. You can see I did all of my lighting adjustments before Dehancer. In case you're not familiar with Final Cut Pro, the inspector goes from top to bottom with the input at the top and the output at the bottom. That means effects at the top of the inspector get processed first and effects at the bottom of the inspector get processed last. Just like in DaVinci Resolve, where your node tree goes from left to right with the input on the left and the output on the right. Again, all of our adjustments are before Dehancer. So let's see what happens if we switch the order around. I will take Dehancer and bring it in front here. For once, you can clearly see the change in brightness of our adjustments doesn't match. Although this has something to do with the order of operations as well, this is not what I want to focus on. Have a look at the color in these areas. Actually, let me pull up the comparison viewer so we can have a look at the before and after. So show in workspace, comparison viewer, and this is before, and now I will move Dehancer before our lighting adjustments. So again, the difference in brightness in these areas doesn't match. But I want you to pay attention to the color as well. Let's get rid of my drawings. The shadows in this version are considerably warmer than we originally intended. That means on the left-hand side, where our lighting adjustments come before Dehancer, the shadow areas are just a lot cooler than they are on the right-hand side, where we switch the order around. This happens because Dehancer introduced some split toning, as we just saw on the black and white gradient. Shadows lean towards blue, and the highlights lean more towards cream orange. Here comes the amazing part. With our lighting adjustments, we push the brightness around, which pushes some areas more into the shadows and some areas more into the highlights. Consequently, this dictates how the split toning provided by Dehancer is affecting the image. This is exactly what I was talking about in the beginning of this video. You don't need complex masks to achieve a proper teal and orange look. As long as you have proper lighting, or at least properly shaped it in post, your look will just work out. Let me make this very clear. If the lighting and the contrast is on point, the things like background separation of your subject will take care of themselves. Let's come back to our black and white gradient. As you can see, if I apply an instance of color wheels before Dehancer, if I just go in here and push the overall exposure around, you can see more things fall into the shadows and therefore they become blue. Or the way around, if I increase the exposure, you can see more things fall into the highlights, therefore they become more cream or orange. This means if you make your background darker before your look adjustment, it automatically gets cooler too. This increases the perceived contrast, which in return creates even more background separation. And I think that's just amazing. By understanding the order of operations and understanding and shaping the light in our scene, we're literally killing two birds with one stone. I know this was quite a lot, so let's do a quick recap of what we learned today. Struggling with complex masks and super targeted adjustments is usually a sign of trying to find a solution to the wrong problem. More often than not, it can be resolved by shaping the light in your scene. Remember, light is the most fundamental quality, and photography literally means drawing with light, so don't sleep on it. Increasing the contrast with the contrast slider will probably not cut it, as it uniformly increases the contrast throughout the scene. In order to shape light effectively, we need to be able to control our adjustments. Always ask yourself what happens, where, and how much of it. When making our adjustments, keep the 4 principles in mind. Number 1. Light motivates our decisions. Work with the natural light in your scene and not against it. Number 2. Reduction beats addition. Remove distractions instead of overcranking your grades. Number 3. Less is more. Use subtle adjustments with simple tools like shape masks or power windows. Number 4. Avoid overcomplication. If you can't achieve it with basic tools, reconsider your adjustment. At the end, when done correctly, shaping light in your scene will simplify your color grade and doesn't complicate it. Make sure you pay attention to the order of operations, as we want to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Remember, light and contrast defines how your look adjustments will operate. If you push things more towards the shadows, they will become cooler, and if you push things more towards the highlights, they will become warmer. When making your adjustments, you're changing the brightness of the things in your scene. And if you have ever wondered how bright things should be, you should watch this video next.